Hello there, and welcome. Find a comfortable spot and let the background noise of your day begin to fade away. There's no need to focus too intently. Just let the sound wash over you. We're here to talk about history, but not the loud, important kind. No grand battles or dramatic speeches. Instead, we're going to drift through some of the quieter, more absurd moments of the past. Tonight, we're going to look at a very specific and very human obsession, the refusal to simply call it a day. We're talking about the powerful, the wealthy, and the royally paranoid, all of whom decided that mortality was a condition for other people. They were convinced that with enough money, enough power, or a sufficiently weird potion, they could simply opt out of the natural order of things. It's a tale as old as time, and one that has produced some of history's most elaborate and spectacularly unsuccessful projects. So settle in, let your breathing slow, and let's begin our story in ancient China with a man who had everything except a decent life insurance policy. His name was Ying Zheng, but you probably know him as Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of a unified China. This was a man who didn't do things by halves. He connected a bunch of existing walls to create a great wall, standardized currency and writing, and commissioned a rather famous army of terracotta soldiers to guard him in the afterlife. He was, by all accounts, an incredibly effective and ruthless administrator. He was also terrified of dying, utterly, completely, and obsessively petrified. This wasn't just a mild concern. It was the driving force behind the latter half of his reign. He had conquered all his rivals on Earth, so he logically assumed his next great conquest would be death itself. The emperor's court became a revolving door of alchemists, mystics, and anyone with a halfway convincing story about an elixir of life. He was the perfect mark, unimaginably powerful, deeply paranoid, and with a budget that could only be described as infinite. His official court alchemists were tasked with one job: make the emperor immortal. No pressure. Failure to do so often resulted in a rather expedited meeting with the great beyond, which ironically only increased the demand for their services. They got to work, mixing potions of questionable ingredients. The prevailing wisdom at the time was that rare and precious materials must hold some secret to longevity, things like jade, gold, and, most fatefully, mercury. Now, mercury, or quicksilver, was seen as a substance of immense spiritual power. It was a liquid metal, which was fascinating. It seemed alive. Surely, if you consume something so magical, some of that magic would rub off on you. So the emperor's physicians began preparing little pills for him, containing a cocktail of herbs and, yes, purified mercury. He took them diligently, believing each one was bringing him a step closer to eternal life. It was, of course, bringing him a step closer to a very specific and very final end. The mercury poisoning likely made him more irritable, more paranoid, and physically ill, which he probably interpreted as signs that the elixir was working its powerful magic, a real vote of confidence in the process. But Qin Shi Huang didn't put all his eggs in one toxic basket. He also heard tales of a mythical place called the Isle of the Immortals, supposedly located somewhere in the Eastern Sea. This island, Panglai, was said to be home to beings who had long ago mastered eternal life, and where the elixir of life grew on trees like common fruit. All one had to do was find it. So he dispatched a massive expedition under the command of a court sorcerer named Shu Fu. The fleet consisted of hundreds of ships carrying thousands of young men and women, along with craftsmen and supplies. Their mission was simple: sail east, find the immortal beings, and don't come back without the recipe for everlasting life. Shu Fu sailed away and never returned. According to some legends, he found Japan instead and decided that starting a new civilization there was a much better career move than returning empty-handed to a deeply paranoid emperor who had been taking mercury mercury pills. It's hard to blame him. Meanwhile, the emperor waited. He conducted grand tours of his empire, partly to show off, and partly because his advisors told him it would keep death on its toes. Unable to find him, he built 200 palaces, all connected by secret tunnels, so no one, not even the spirits, would know where he was sleeping on any given night. His paranoia was all-consuming. In the end, for all his efforts, the emperor died at the relatively young age of 49 during one of his tours of eastern China. The official cause, though not stated as such, was almost certainly a catastrophic system failure brought on by chronic mercury poisoning. His own quest for immortality had killed him. The irony is so thick you could build a wall with it. His prime minister, Li Si, was faced with a problem. The emperor's death on the road, far from the capital, could trigger an immediate succession crisis and civil war. So he did the only logical thing. He pretended the emperor was still alive. For the next 2 months, the dead emperor continued his imperial tour. His body was kept in his carriage, and his entourage maintained the daily routine. Servants brought his meals, officials presented their reports, and decrees were issued in his name. To mask the smell of decomposition as the summer heat set in, carts of salted fish were ordered to travel alongside the emperor's carriage. Imagine the scene: the most powerful man in the world, dead in a box, being followed around by a convoy of rotting fish to cover up the fact that his grand plan to live forever had gone slightly awry. It was the ultimate anticlimax to a life built on absolute control. And so the man who moved mountains and commanded armies was ultimately defeated by a few poorly conceived dietary supplements. A cautionary tale, if there ever was one. Having left ancient China and its particularly potent brand of immortality seeking, let's drift westward. Let's float over the mountains and steppes and find ourselves in the Mediterranean, where another empire was making its mark. The Romans, known for their roads, their aqueducts, their legions, and their general talent for organization. You'd think a society so practical would have a more sensible approach to longevity, and you would be mostly wrong. The Romans were masters of engineering, but when it came to medicine, their philosophy often boiled down to a mixture of folk remedies, divine appeals, and just hoping for the best. While they didn't have a singular, all-consuming quest for an elixir of life like Qin Shi Huang, the Roman elite were certainly interested in sticking around for as long as possible. Life expectancy was not exactly high. If you survived childhood, you still had to contend with disease, plagues, political assassinations, and some truly questionable culinary practices. For the average Roman, the goal was less about living forever and more about just making it to next Tuesday. The emperors, however, had grander ambitions. They were, after all, considered semi-divine. It seemed only fitting that they should get a few extra millennia out of the deal. One of the more interesting figures in this regard wasn't even a Roman, but one of their most persistent enemies, Mithridates VI of Pontus. He ruled a kingdom on the Black Sea and spent most of his life fighting Rome. He was also, much like our Chinese emperor, deeply paranoid. His specific fear wasn't just death, but poison. His father had been assassinated by poison at a banquet, and Mithridates was determined not to meet the same fate. So he embarked on a lifelong mission to make himself immune
to every poison known to man. He essentially turned his body into a personal toxicology lab. He would take small, sublethal doses of various poisons every day, gradually increasing the amount. He experimented on criminals, forcing them to ingest toxins and then testing antidotes on them. It was a very hands-on approach to pharmacology. Over decades, he developed what he believed was a universal antidote, a complex concoction of dozens of ingredients known as the Mithridate. The exact recipe is lost, but it was said to include things like opium, viper flesh, and a variety of herbs. He took a dose of this every single day. His dedication was admirable in a deeply strange way. The ultimate test of his work came at the end of his life, defeated by the Roman general Pompey, and with his own son leading a rebellion against him. Mithridates decided it was time to check out. He tried to poison himself, and in a moment of supreme irony, he failed. His body had become so accustomed to the various toxins he had ingested over the years that the poison had no effect. He had succeeded so completely in his life's work that it prevented him from achieving his final wish. He ultimately had to ask one of his own bodyguards to kill him with a sword, a less elegant but far more effective solution. It seems even when you win the battle against death, you still lose the war. Back in Rome, the emperors themselves had their own peculiar health regimens. The Emperor Augustus, for example, was famously plagued by ill health his entire life. He tried everything. His physicians prescribed an array of bizarre treatments, from cold water baths to wrapping himself in blankets made from the skin of Spanish seals. His diet was also specific. One of his favorite remedies for a bad stomach was to eat a piece of bread that had been soaked in cold water. It was simple, inexpensive, and probably did absolutely nothing. But when you're the emperor and you feel a bit better after eating soggy bread, it becomes imperial medical doctrine. The Romans also put a great deal of faith in omens and portents. The health of the emperor wasn't just a personal matter, it was tied to the health of the state. So if a flock of birds flew in the wrong direction, or a chicken's liver looked a bit off, it wasn't just a bad day for the chicken, it was a potential national crisis. Pliny the Elder, a Roman author and naturalist, compiled a massive work called Natural History, which was filled with thousands of supposed remedies. To cure a headache, he suggested tying a fox's genitals to your head. For epilepsy, he recommended drinking the blood of a slain gladiator fresh from the arena floor. This was considered cutting-edge science. It's this contrast that makes Rome so fascinating. They could engineer a system of aqueducts to bring fresh water to 1 million people, a feat of sanitation that undoubtedly saved countless lives. But the man who designed that aqueduct might go home and treat his arthritis by rubbing himself with bear grease and chanting at the moon. They were a people of immense practical genius, living in a world still governed by deep superstition. Their understanding of the world was a mile wide and in some places an inch deep. And so the Roman elite didn't chase a single magical elixir. Instead, they fought a scattered, chaotic battle against mortality on a dozen different fronts, using everything from advanced plumbing to gladiator blood. The results were, as you might expect, mixed. Most of them died anyway, often in ways that were violent, sudden, and had very little to do with the quality of their drinking water.
As the Roman Empire slowly crumbled, taking its unique blend of sophisticated infrastructure and dubious medical advice with it, Europe entered a new phase. The centuries that followed are often painted as a dark age of superstition, which isn't entirely fair, but it was certainly a time of creative thinking. The quest for extended life didn't vanish, it simply changed its branding. It moved indoors, into the smoky, cluttered laboratories of the alchemists. And here, the search for immortality became tangled up with another, equally compelling ambition: getting rich quick. The central goal of European alchemy was the creation of the Philosopher's Stone. This wasn't just any stone. It was a legendary substance that could do two things. First, it could transmute base metals, like lead, into pure gold. This was the part that got the attention of kings and queens, who were perpetually in need of funds for their wars and palaces. The second, and arguably more important, property of the stone was its ability to produce the elixir of life. A single drop of this elixir could supposedly cure any disease, restore youth, and grant immortality. It was the ultimate two-for-one deal. You could live forever, and you'd be able to afford the upkeep. For centuries, alchemists across Europe and the Islamic world toiled away in secret. Their work was shrouded in mysticism, complex symbolism, and deliberately obscure texts. This was partly to protect their trade secrets, and partly because many of them weren't entirely sure what they were doing, and a bit of fancy language helped cover that up. They worked with alembics and crucibles, heating, distilling, and combining substances in an endless series of experiments. The ingredients were often allegorical. When a text called for the blood of the red lion or the tears of the philosophical dragon, it wasn't a grocery list, it was a coded instruction, usually referring to specific chemical compounds. Though you can be sure at least a few hapless apprentices were sent on some very strange errands. One of the most famous names associated with this quest is Nicolas Flamel, a 14th century Parisian scribe. According to legend, Flamel came into possession of a mysterious ancient book filled with alchemical secrets. After decades of study, he and his wife, Paranoia, supposedly succeeded in creating the Philosopher's Stone. They became fabulously wealthy, endowing churches and hospitals throughout Paris. And, the story goes, they also sampled the elixir of life, faked their own deaths, and lived on for centuries. It's a wonderful story. It's also almost certainly not true. The real Flamel was a successful property investor. The tales of his alchemical prowess were attached to his name centuries after his death, likely because people needed a good success story. Alchemy, after all, produced very few of them. The real work of alchemy was less about magic and more about messy, smelly, and often dangerous proto-chemistry. Alchemists did make some important discoveries. They perfected distillation, discovered new acids and elements, and laid some of the groundwork for modern chemistry. But these were often byproducts of their main and ultimately fruitless quest. A German alchemist named Hennig Brand was trying to create the Philosopher's Stone in 1669. His theory was that gold could be distilled from a golden substance. Following this impeccable logic, he decided to work with human urine. He collected vast quantities of it, gallons upon gallons, and boiled it down to a thick paste, which he then superheated. The process was, by all accounts, spectacularly unpleasant, but it didn't produce gold. Instead, it produced a white, waxy substance that
that glowed in the dark. He had discovered phosphorus. It was a monumental scientific breakthrough, but for Brand, it was just another dead end on the road to eternal riches. Royal courts were a hotbed of alchemical activity. Monarchs, always in debt and intrigued by the promise of a long life, became willing patrons. Emperor Rudolph II in 16th century Prague turned his entire castle into a massive center for occult studies. He invited alchemists, astrologers, and magicians from all over Europe, including the famous English duo John Dee and Edward Kelly. They promised him the secrets of the universe. They spent years at his court conducting elaborate rituals and experiments, all funded by the imperial treasury. They produced plenty of cryptic prophecies and claims of angelic conversations, but the philosopher's stone remained stubbornly elusive. The royal coffers were drained, and Rudolph was left with little more than a collection of strange artifacts and a reputation for being eccentric. The dream was a powerful one. It combined the deepest human desires, wealth, health, and the defeat of time itself. But the path was built on a foundation of misunderstanding. Alchemists believed the world was made of 4 elements: earth, air, fire, and water, and that everything was a combination of spiritual and physical properties. To turn lead into gold wasn't just a chemical change, it was a process of purification, of raising a base metal to a state of perfection. The creation of the elixir of life was part of this same spiritual journey. In a way, they were trying to perfect matter itself. It was a noble, if deeply misguided, ambition. And so, for 1,000 years, they toiled in their labs, surrounded by strange symbols and the faint glow of phosphorus, chasing a golden dream that was always just out of reach.
As alchemy continued its slow, meandering journey toward becoming actual chemistry, other, more direct approaches to staying young were being explored. Some of these methods were less about complex distillation and more about aggressive exfoliation. Let's drift now to the turn of the 17th century, to the Kingdom of Hungary, and meet a noblewoman whose name has become synonymous with a particularly grim beauty regimen. Her name was Countess Elizabeth Bathory. The legend of Elizabeth Bathory is a chilling one. She was a wealthy, powerful widow who, as she grew older, became obsessed with preserving her youthful beauty. The story goes that after striking a servant girl and seeing the girl's blood splash onto her hand, she believed her skin looked younger where the blood had been. This sparked a horrific idea. She began to believe that bathing in the blood of young virgin girls would act as a kind of fountain of youth. Over the years, according to the tales, she and her servants lured hundreds of girls to her castle, where they were tortured and murdered, their blood collected for the Countess's gruesome beauty treatments. It's the stuff of Gothic horror novels, and much like a Gothic horror novel, the story is probably a vast exaggeration. Elizabeth Bathory was a real person, and she was certainly no saint. She was a powerful and often cruel landowner in a time and place where life was cheap. After her husband's death, she ruled her estates with an iron fist. There is substantial evidence that she was responsible for the abuse and death of a number of her servants. However, the more lurid details, the bloodbaths, the Iron Maiden, the hundreds of victims, only emerged after her arrest. Her trial was largely a show trial, orchestrated by her political rivals, who had a keen interest in seizing her vast lands and wealth. Accusations of witchcraft and vampirism were a convenient way to discredit a powerful woman who stood in their way. So, the image of her as a kind of vampiric countess, bathing in blood to stay young, is likely more fiction than fact. But the legend itself tells us something important about the anxieties of the age. The idea that youth and life could be stolen from the young and transferred to the old was a potent one. It taps into a primal fear of aging and a belief that life is a finite resource that can be siphoned from one person to another. It reduces the quest for immortality to a brutal zero-sum game. While the alchemists were trying to perfect matter through complex science, the legend of Bathory presents a much cruder path, a shortcut through violence. It's a dark fantasy, but one that resonated because it played on the well-known cruelty of the nobility and the deep-seated belief that the powerful would do anything to maintain their position. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, a different kind of legend was taking shape, one involving less blood and more water. Let's drift across the Atlantic to the New World in the early 16th century. Here, we find the Spanish conquistador Juan Ponce de Leon. History remembers him for one thing: his supposed search for the Fountain of Youth. The story is a classic of exploration folklore. An aging explorer, having conquered Puerto Rico, hears tales from the native people of a magical spring on an island called Bimini. Anyone who drinks from this fountain will have their youth restored. Driven by vanity, Ponce de Leon outfits an expedition and sails north, landing in a lush, flower-covered land which he names La Florida. He searches for the fountain, but finds only swamps, hostile natives, and ultimately an arrow that leads to his death. It's a neat, tidy story about the folly of chasing impossible dreams. It's also, once again, not really what happened. Ponce de Leon's primary motivations for sailing to Florida were the same as every other conquistador: gold, land, and glory. The royal contract for his expedition tasked him with exploring and colonizing the new lands, with no mention of any magical fountains. The connection between him and the Fountain of Youth was made by rival historians decades after his death as a way to mock him and make him look like a foolish, vain old man. It was a successful smear campaign. The story stuck. The legend of a Fountain of Youth wasn't new. It had appeared in stories for centuries, from the tales of Alexander the Great to the fictional travels of Sir John Mandeville. It was a well-worn trope. What the Spanish explorers did was transplant this old European myth into the New World. For them, America was a land of wonders, a place where anything seemed possible. If there was gold in the mountains and strange new animals in the forests, why not a magical fountain? The natives, for their part, likely told the Spaniards what they wanted to hear, or their stories of sacred springs and healing waters were simply misinterpreted by the Europeans through the lens of their own myths. So we have two enduring legends of the quest for eternal youth. One, a dark tale of a vampiric countess born from political intrigue and fear. The other, a romantic story of a questing conquistador born from a posthumous political smear. Neither is historically accurate, but both tell us more about the people telling the stories than the subjects themselves. They reveal a deep-seated cynicism about the motivations of the powerful, whether it's a countess stealing life from her servants or a governor chasing a magical spring. The underlying assumption is the same, that those in charge will stop at nothing, no matter how absurd or cruel, to cheat death, and that, at least, has the ring of truth to it. Let's move on from the more ambitious projects of creating elixirs and finding fountains. For most of history's elite, the goal was less about achieving true immortality and more about simply not dying from something preventable, like a toothache or a mild infection. This led to a whole world of royal medicine, a field that was one part tradition, one part superstition, and a very, very small part actual science. And in this world, sometimes the best medicine was believed to be the king himself. Enter the concept of the royal touch. For centuries, starting in the Middle Ages in both England and France, it was widely believed that the monarch had a God-given, divinely sanctioned ability to heal certain diseases simply by touching the afflicted person. The specific disease they were thought to cure was scrofula, a form of tuberculosis that affects the lymph nodes in the neck, causing nasty sores and swellings. It was commonly known as the king's evil, on the assumption that only a king could cure it. This was, from a public relations perspective, pure genius. The process was highly ritualized. Huge crowds of sick people would gather for healing ceremonies. The king or queen would proceed down a long line, touching each person's face or neck, while a priest recited prayers. Each person touched was also given a special coin called a touch piece to wear around their neck to prevent the disease from returning. This was an incredibly popular practice. Kings like Louis XIV of France and Charles II of England touched thousands upon thousands of people during their reigns. For the common person, it was a chance to get close to the divine power of the monarchy. For the monarch, it was a powerful way to reinforce their legitimacy and their special connection to God. It was a political tool disguised as a medical procedure. Did it work? Of course not. Scrofula is a cyclical disease. It can flare up and then go into remission on its own. It's likely that a certain number of people who were touched by the king would have gotten better anyway, which was all the proof anyone needed. The power of placebo, combined with a bit of good timing, was enough to keep the tradition alive for centuries. It's a testament to the power of belief. If enough people, including the king himself, believe that a touch can heal, then, for all practical purposes, it does. Until, of course, it doesn't. The practice finally died out in the 18th century as the Enlightenment brought a slightly more scientific and less reverent view of monarchs. Beyond miraculous healing touches, the day-to-day health of a monarch was a matter of intense state interest. The royal body was not a private affair. Everything that went into it and everything that came out of it was subject to scrutiny by a team of royal physicians. These physicians were often courtiers than doctors. Their primary job wasn't necessarily to heal the king, but to manage his health in a way that didn't cause him any discomfort or inconvenience, and to not be the one on duty when he finally died. This led to some truly peculiar medical advice. Let's take a look at the court of Louis XIV, the Sun King of France. He ruled for 72 years, an impressive feat in an era of primitive medicine. He was also a man of immense appetite and famously poor health. He suffered from gout, boils, fainting spells, and a legendary case of dental problems. An operation to remove a bad tooth in 1685 went horribly wrong, resulting in the surgeons removing part of his upper jaw and palate. He was left with a hole connecting his mouth to his nasal cavity. This meant that every time he drank something, part of it would come out of his nose, unless the hole was plugged with a specially made cloth. It was, to put it mildly, not ideal. His physician's approach to his various ailments was rooted in the ancient theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. The goal was to keep these in balance. The primary tools for doing this were bleeding, purging, and enemas. Lots and lots of enemas. The king's medical records show that he received over 2,000 enemas in his lifetime, sometimes flavored with pleasant scents like rose or bergamot. It was a routine part of his day. His diet was also a source of constant concern and commentary. He ate gargantuan meals, and his doctors would debate endlessly about which foods were causing his indigestion. Their solution was often another round of purges, a treatment that likely left him weakened and dehydrated, but which was seen as a necessary cleansing. This was the paradox of royal healthcare. A king had access to the most learned physicians of his time, but the medical knowledge of the time was, by modern standards, abysmal. They were working with a completely flawed model of the human body. So the king's life was a constant cycle of overindulgence, followed by aggressive and often harmful medical interventions. It's a miracle any of them lived as long as they did. They were surrounded by people whose job it was to keep them alive, but who were armed with little more than theories, lances for bloodletting, and an endless supply of enema fluid. It was a strange and delicate dance where the cure was often just as dangerous as the disease.
And so we drift forward out of the era of powdered wigs and ceremonial purging and into the more familiar territory of the modern world. The quest to cheat death didn't end with the Enlightenment. It just got a new lab coat and a better marketing budget. The alchemist's dream of an elixir was replaced by the scientist's search for a formula, but the underlying desire remained exactly the same. The weird and wonderful world of longevity science had begun. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, as science began to unlock the secrets of biology, new theories of aging emerged. One popular idea was that aging was caused by a loss of vital fluids or hormonal decline. This led to some inventive treatments. A French-American doctor named Charles Edward Brown Séquard made headlines in 1889 when he announced that he had developed a rejuvenating fluid. At the age of 72, he injected himself with a concoction derived from the testicular fluid of dogs and guinea pigs. He claimed it restored his physical strength and intellectual energy. The Brown Séquard elixir became a sensation, and soon doctors everywhere were offering injections of animal gland extracts to wealthy, aging men. The treatment was, of course, pure quackery with a powerful placebo effect. Another popular theory revolved around the idea of auto-intoxication, basically that the body was being poisoned from within by waste products in the colon. The proposed solution was, as you might imagine, a thorough cleaning. The Russian biologist Elie Metnikov, who actually won a Nobel Prize for his work on immunology, became a vocal proponent of the idea that a diet rich in yogurt and its good bacteria could prolong life by combating the bad bacteria in the gut. Others went further, advocating for a variety of extreme diets, fasting regimens, and in the most extreme cases, the surgical removal of the colon entirely. The focus had shifted from mystical elixirs to the internal mechanics of the body, but the goal was the same: to purify the system and hold back the tide of decay. And that brings us gently to the present day. The quest for immortality is no longer the domain of paranoid emperors and eccentric nobles. Today, it's the passion project of Silicon Valley tech billionaires. The new patrons of longevity research are the titans of an industry built on optimization and hacking systems, and they've approached the problem of human aging as just another system to be debugged. They've swapped the alchemist's laboratory for state-of-the-art biotech labs, and the search for the philosopher's stone has been replaced by the hunt for the right combination of gene therapy,
stem cell treatments, and personalized supplements. The language has changed, but the echoes of the past are unmistakable. Instead of mercury pills, there are complex supplement stacks and nootropic drugs, each promising to optimize cognitive function and cellular health. Instead of searching for a mythical fountain of youth, there is research into young blood transfusions, a practice based on the theory that youthful blood contains proteins that can rejuvenate older bodies. It's a scientifically phrased version of the same idea that may have lurked in the dark tales of Elizabeth Bathory, that youth is a substance that can be transferred. Instead of consulting astrologers, the modern seeker of long life consults their wearable tech, tracking every heartbeat, every step, and every calorie in a quest for data-driven perfection. The goal is no longer a vague immortality, but more specific, scientifically plausible-sounding targets, like reversing the epigenetic clock, or achieving escape velocity for longevity, or solving death. The ambition is just as grand as Qin Shi Huang's, but it's cloaked in the language of disruption and innovation. It's a very human story, repeating itself with new costumes and new props. The fear of death, the desire for control, and the belief that enough wealth and power can bend the rules of nature. These are constants. It's a reminder that for all our incredible technological progress, some of our deepest, most ancient anxieties remain firmly in place. And so, our journey ends. From the mercury-addled courts of ancient China to the biohacking labs of California, the story has been remarkably consistent. It's a story of hope, hubris, and a fundamental misunderstanding of the fine print on the contract of life. It seems that the desire to live forever is one of history's most reliable sources of absurdity. And perhaps there's a certain comfort in that, the knowledge that for all of history, the most powerful people on Earth have been just as confused and just as afraid as everyone else. And on that rather peaceful thought, perhaps it's time to rest. Let the story fade and just sleep.